your eternal life. It ought to be done within the family and considered a religious and ethical issue and not something that politicians deal with.
Not something that politicians deal with. As the top Republican in the Senate on the issue of health care, Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley, and he says what happens at the end of your life is something for within your family. It's not something politicians should deal with. Big round of applause for him on that. I mean, honestly though, can you imagine that something as important as a person's circumstances at the capital E end would be something that politicians would even think they have the right to comment on, let alone intervene in? Can you even imagine that?
In extraordinary circumstances like this, it is wise to always err on the side of life.
The president abruptly returned from his Texas ranch Sunday as the crisis unfolded.
We have a moral obligation to protect and defend her.
We've not been able to act quickly enough as Congress to step in.
If we do not act, she will die of thirst.
This is not a political issue. This is an issue about this girl's life.
I thought it was appropriate for the federal government to protect.
So it was appropriate for the federal government, specifically for the Republican Party, to get involved in a private family health care decision in 2005. When Terry Schiavo's next of kin, her husband Michael Schiavo, tried to carry out what he said were his wife's end-of-life wishes, it was the Republican Party who decided that actually the government knew better. Actually, the politicians understood this better than that family, and the government should intervene. And now many of the very same people who interfered in Michael and Terry Schiavo's health care decisions at the end of Terry Schiavo's life, the politicians who brought that end-of-life decision to the floor of the U.S. Capitol, they are arguing against health care reform now on the grounds that they don't want the government to interfere in end-of-life decisions. What the big D Democratic government of 2009 put in the House health care reform bill was Medicare funding for people who, of their own volition, wanted to seek living wills or counseling about end-of-life decisions from their doctor. And as of today, that good policy idea, the genuinely righteous, previously totally non-controversial, nonpartisan effort to put patients in control of what happens at the end of their lives, is apparently off the table. Senator Grassley of Iowa, the ranking Republican on the Senate Finance Committee, announcing that the living wills provision will be taken out of the Senate's proposed health care reform bill. There may be authentic reasons that many Republicans oppose reforming health care. But a concern about government inserting itself into decisions about end-of-life matters is not one of them. That purported concern coming from the people who brought you the President of the United States cutting short his vacation in order to interfere in one family's end-of-life healthcare decision. The president who couldn't cut short his vacation for bin Laden determined to strike inside the U.S., but could cut short his vacation to Bigfoot the end-of-life decision-making of Michael and Terry Schiavo. Joining us now is George Filos. He was the attorney for Michael Schiavo during the battle over the death of his wife. Mr. Filos, thanks very much for coming on the show.
My pleasure, Rachel. Thank you.
Having fought this battle with Michael Schiavo in 2005, do you feel like you're seeing some of the same people who were interfering in the Schiavo's medical decisions then now arguing against health care reform ostensibly because they don't think the government should interfere in personal medical decisions?
Well, there are some similarities to the Schiavo case in the debate, and I think one of them is this. End-of-life decision-making for patients is a very sensitive issue. People have legitimate fears. They have legitimate concerns about that. And in the Schiavo case, those legitimate fears and concerns were exploited for political and ideological reasons. And I think that's what we're seeing now done in an opposite way.
Of course, it has been demonized to get people to be afraid of health care reform. And now apparently this provision is out of the bill. But can you describe the utility of the kind of living will provision that is at the heart of all this? The idea that Medicare would reimburse doctors if patients wanted to get living will counseling, end-of-life counseling from their doctors, and they were already covered by Medicare.
Well, this conversation between a doctor and a patient, which has been so demonized and mischaracterized, is very simple. You have a patient, let's say, who's in a terminal condition or an end-stage condition, and perhaps they're being admitted to a facility, a hospital or nursing home, where the time comes to have the conversation. And the doctor may say, well, if your heart stops beating, what do you want to have happen? Do you want to be resuscitated or not? And the patient says, well, what's the pros and cons? And the doctor may say, well, if we resuscitate you, there's a 20% chance that you'll be unconscious. There's a 40% chance that you may awake but have severe brain damage, and there's a 40% chance you may be all right. And the patient may say, well, how much more time may that buy me? And the doctor may say, well, that's about 4 months, 6 months. The patient digests that information, talks to his family members about it, and comes to a reasoned decision. That's the most sensible and practical thing a patient and doctor can do, and that empowers patients to make decisions that's right for them and right for their families.
By talking about that, by characterizing that kind of conversation as a way essentially to enforce euthanasia in this country in order to even kill people against their will, even tell people who are considering healthcare measures that they can't have those healthcare measures because they're somehow not economically worthy. Those are the ways that what you've just described has been sort of perverted in the description about healthcare reform. Do you think that permanent damage is being done to the idea of people getting living wills?
Well, I certainly hope not. And you have to remember that propagation of fear as a technique may work in the short term, but it never works in the long term. If you take the Shiloh case as an example, those proponents of interfering with private decision making, those opponents who exploited the Shiloh case, it was downhill for them politically after that. So, I hope that there's no damage being occurred, because physicians and patients need all the help they can get to get together and make these decisions. Rachel, most people don't want to die in an ICU on a ventilator or with tubes in their body. People would like to die at home. They'd like to die in familiar surroundings with their loved ones and pain-free. But unless you tell your doctor what you want and you refuse those procedures, the default position is treatment. And you have countless Americans in this country who don't talk to their doctors and don't have that communication, that get aggressive treatment at the end of the life that they don't want. And that's a tragedy. And it's a tragedy also that the opponents of this provision are mischaracterizing it so greatly. We need a genuine conversation about end-of-life decision making, how to help the patient, how to help the physician. And the only thing that this bill does is say, we'll pay the doctor for the conversation.
George Felix, former attorney for Michael Shiloh, perfectly clarifying remarks on this tonight. Thanks for helping us get through it. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Rachel.